Hello and welcome to Teachers for Palestine's third episode in our webinar series. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we properly get going. So please do follow us on Instagram, Teachers for Palestine, or on Twitter at Teachers4Pal. Also, please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you'd like to stay up and abreast of the stuff that we're putting out. We hope to continue this series of webinars, and we will have some very interesting speakers lined up ahead as well. Today we are joined by Dr. Waleed Serhan. Waleed is a Palestinian refugee and an Irish citizen based in Dublin. His research concerns the refugee experience in Lebanon in particular, and in today's episode Dr. Serhan draws on both his academic research and his personal and family history to really convey the situation of a huge group of Palestinians we don't often hear of in the news, the refugees. This issue has become even more pertinent since the time of recording, as in response to the ICJ case taken by South Africa and the use of evidence from UN sources in that case that was taken. We've started to see a lot of Western governments pull funding for UNRWA, who provide a lot of very necessary services to Palestinian refugees. Anyway, I won't delay any more. On to you, Waleed.
Okay, thank you very much, Connell, for that, and I'll just share my screen. Okay, so very generic title, basic title: Palestinian refugees, a brief overview. And as Connell said, I'm Waleed Serhan. I'm a Palestinian Irish sociologist. So the Palestinian refugee crisis is one of the longest, it's not one of, it's the longest unresolved refugee crisis. It's been going on for 75 years. The displacement began between 1947 and 1949, but mainly in 1948 in what Palestinians call al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. And that's when the Zionist paramilitary occupied 78% of the historic land of Palestine and created the State of Israel on 14 May 1948. In this period, about half the Palestinian population, the indigenous Palestinian population, was displaced to neighboring countries. 700,000 to 800,000 refugees were displaced to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And these are according to UN and British mandate figures. So these are accurate figures. Half of the population was expelled. Again, in 1967, there was the June War between Israel and some of the neighboring Arab countries. And that was called al-Naksa, or the setback, and an additional 300,000 Palestinian refugees, many who went to Jordan and Gaza at the time. These refugees and their descendants have been denied the right to return by Israel to this day. And many of them still reside in Palestinian refugee camps of the neighboring countries to this day. I will show photos of what the Palestinian refugee camps looked like back in 1949, 48, and nowadays. I'm personally a Palestinian refugee. I know I introduced myself as Palestinian Irish. I got the Irish citizenship at some point, but for most of my life, I had a Palestinian refugee document from Lebanon. I also feel Irish. It's not just about the citizenship. I feel both Irish and Palestinian. So the current figures, so these are according to UNRWA. UNRWA is the UN agency that specifically was established for Palestinian refugees in 1949, so 1 year after the occupation and colonization of Palestine. And UNRWA, if you want to know what it stands for, it is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in the Near East. So according to the UNRWA figures, there are 5.9 million Palestinian refugees registered in 2023. So the actual figure could actually be closer to 7 million, because to be registered with UNRWA, you have to actively do it. And some of the Palestinians that attained other citizenships might, especially when it comes to their children, might stop registering with UNRWA. So the number of Palestinian refugees at the moment can be up to 7 million, but if you want a definite figure, then 5.9 million is the UNRWA figure. And these are distributed with the bulk of them are in Jordan with 2.2 million refugees, Syria with 440,000 million refugees. There used to be around 500,000, but with the recent conflict, around 60,000 migrated or fled from the conflict. In Lebanon, there's 480,000 registered, but the actual figure now is 250,000. And you will see later in the presentation that the condition of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon is the toughest. And this led to wide-scale migration. There's a lot of restrictions that I will talk about later. There's also Palestinian refugees in Palestine itself, both in Gaza and the West Bank. So in Gaza, there's 1.7 million refugees of a total of 2.2 million people in the whole of the Gaza Strip. So the majority of the population of Gaza are refugees, and they're being threatened with being expelled again, being made refugees again. Israel is threatening to expel them to Egypt if they can, and so on. So far, they're holding ground, but there is always a risk. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, there's 870,000 Palestinian refugees. And these refugees were come mainly from northern historic Palestine, because that was the first part of Palestine that was occupied and colonized in 1948. And the West Bank and Gaza were occupied later in 1967. I'm not going to get into these details much because maybe they were covered already, or maybe some the coming speakers are going to cover this. I'm just going to focus on the refugees. Of the almost 6 million Palestinian refugees, 1.5 million of those still live in 58 officially recognized Palestinian refugee camps in the above locations. I just mentioned the countries and the Gaza and West Bank. So if you're wondering what the refugee camps looked like in 1949, this photo is actually, I'm going to use a bit of personal history because I am also a Palestinian refugee. And this photo is actually, the woman in the photo is actually my grandmother, and she was working with UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. She was kind of a strong woman for her time. You can see she's surrounded mainly by men. So that was the refugees in the refugee camps in 1949, and they stayed this way for another 5 years. They were mainly tents. At the moment, they've become more like concrete jungles. So this is a current photo of a refugee camp in Lebanon in the suburb of Beirut. Conditions are quite tough there. A lot of families would be living, you would have 5 to 7 members sharing one room. Palestinian families tend to be big. They're getting smaller, obviously, with more modernization and higher cost of living and so on, like everywhere else in the world, but they're very crowded, these camps. And like these camps in Lebanon would be around 1 square kilometers. And this one at the peak had around 30,000 residents living in 1 square kilometer. There's another camp in the south with around 70,000 inhabitants or residents in 1 square kilometer as well. This is also the interior of a refugee camp in Lebanon. You can see like murals of the, either fighters or martyrs or different political parties. There's these small shops that sell basic goods and so on. You can see a lot of electric wires. This is actually quite a problem because there's thousands of these wires all over the camp, and a few people get electrocuted and could die every month. So it's a bit of a Russian roulette situation. If you're living in the camp, you don't know when one of these wires will just snatch and fall on you. And, this might seem like just another impoverished, shanty town or so, but these people actually had their homes in Palestine, whether they were in cities or if they were in their villages. They also had their homes, their farms, or prosperous towns and so on. And suddenly they're all cramped for decades into these very crowded, on a very small space of land and very bad infrastructure refugee camps. So who is a Palestine refugee? There is actually a legal definition for who a Palestinian refugee is, and this comes from UNRWA. And Palestine refugee, and I'm quoting, relates to people whose normal place of residence was Palestine between 1st of June 1946 and 15 May 1948, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. This is a UN definition. And you might wonder how I'm saying I'm a Palestinian refugee. I've actually never been to Palestine, and I identify as Palestinian. And it's the same with the 6 million Palestinians that I just mentioned. A lot of them have never seen Palestine. At least 4 or 5 million haven't seen Palestine and still identify as Palestinian. Um, there's several reasons for that, but if you look at the legal definition under international law, again from the UN and the principle of family unity, the children of refugees and their descendants are also considered refugees until a durable solution is found. And this is the definition that both UNRWA and the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, recognize the descendants as refugees, and this practice is widely accepted by the international community. The right of many Palestinian refugees hold on to the right of return to Palestine, even with the passage of all this time. And this right is enshrined in UN Resolution 194, which was actually issued in 1948, the year the occupation and colonization happened. And again, quoting the UN resolution says, refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for the loss or damage of the property which under principles of international law or equity should be made by the governments or authorities responsible. So our right to return to Palestine is enshrined in UN law by the international community. You will see later in the presentation, you might wonder why, after all these decades and living in different countries, why we still hold on to the right of return. And part of it is wherever we go, we don't fully belong. Even in my case, a very pro-Palestine and welcoming country like Ireland, you will never fully belong wherever you go for your entire life. And there's that feeling that, that touches on your dignity, on your feelings of belonging and identity, and so on. So one of the founding narratives of the Zionist leaders back in the 1940s, when they were beginning to colonize and settle in Palestine, that Palestine is a land without people for a people without a land. And they mean a land without people as Palestine didn't have Palestinians, we don't exist. And people without a land are Jews who are a nation, but they don't have a land. But if we look at the figures, again, in 1890, Jews comprised 3.5% of the population. And even by the time Palestine was occupied in 1948, due to Jewish migration or settlement, mainly from Europe, the population reached 30% of the entire population of Palestine. And I say migration or settlement because some Jews were really just migrating, and some were more Zionist settlers coming to take the land and away from Palestinians and make it their own. So there is distinction between Jewish and Zionist that I'm trying to highlight. In 1948, Jews owned only 5 to 7% of the land. And why I'm saying this, in the UN and international laws that I just mentioned, there was a big focus on property of the refugees, their homes, what happened to these homes and lands. So in 1947, 70% of the population was still Palestinian Muslims and Christians, even with all the Jewish settlement and migration. And in 1948, at least 93% of the land was still Palestinian owned. Palestinians did not sell their land to Zionists. A very small minority did, and some absentee landlords did. But the land was mainly just taken from them. And in the 1947 to 1949 conflict, over 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed and ethnically cleansed. And there are both Palestinian and Israeli historians like Rashid Khalidi or Alan Pepe, who talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Our village was actually razed to the ground and we were expelled to Lebanon. It's called El Kabri. And then once it got colonized, it was called Kibbutz Kabri. And kibbutz is the socialist farmers commune that some Europeans in the 60s were going to Israel to join, thinking this is a great socialist community. The only problem is these communes are built on ethnically cleansed land. There's a lot of history to our village. I know it's just a village, but if you are interested, there's a lot to it in terms of battle and history and so on. So Palestinians did not just flee from Palestine. This is another Israeli narrative that we don't deserve to go back because we just fled when there was conflict. The majority were expelled. Our village was razed to the ground. There's a battle, a famous battle that you can Google. There were thousands of people killed. There were thousands of people threatened that if they go back to their homes, they would be killed. So there was an ethnic cleansing, and through violence. We did not just flee as the Israeli narrative, one of the dominant Israeli narratives would like to argue. So the refugees are sometimes, shamed that they just left their country and they don't deserve to go back. And talking about the land, again, I'm kind of doing like an autoethnography. I'm kind of doing this through family history. This is land documents, like papers that I actually own. I have the originals. So this is from the Ottoman era. So Palestine was under Ottoman rule up until 1918, up until the end of World War I. I think Connell might have talked about that in his first presentation. I'm not sure. But we never sold this land, and I still have these documents, and I have more than one. This is actually from 1890. It's over 130 years old. It's got a pretty cool logo at the top for the time, and also the stamp at the bottom. I'm not sure if you can see. These are also land papers that we have that came from the British mandate. So after the Ottomans left, the British colonized Palestine, or what they like to more likely call a mandate. And you can see on the top that it says Government of Palestine. And this also brings us to a narrative that with these, one of the dominant is anti-Palestinian Israeli narratives, that Palestine never existed. Actually, the whole region was under Ottoman rule and then either under British or French rule, except we had to go through a third colonization with the Zionist movement. And that's why we never existed as an independent state. Modern states are modern phenomena, as you know, and the whole region didn't exist in states. We just had a third wave of colonization. The rest ended with the British and the French. Again, here, this is a land deed. You can see a stamp. I don't know if I can zoom in a bit. It says Palestine in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. This is from the 1940s. This is an original Palestine stamp that I have. Also, kind of contradicting the fact that there was never anything near to a Palestinian state. There was supposed to be a Palestinian state after this stage, just like other countries in the region, like Lebanon and Jordan and Syria and so on. Sorry, I have to zoom this back in. Okay, so I'll go to the present conditions. I kind of started with a historical and current overview. So conditions in Lebanon. So Lebanon has the least population now at around 250,000. But the reason I'm starting with this is because I did my PhD thesis on the exclusion of Palestine, the legal exclusion of Palestinians by the Lebanese state. And I know the most about Lebanon. So Palestinians in Lebanon are legally denied the right to work in many professions. I know this might sound weird that they've been there 75 years and they still can't work in many professions legally. They're legally prohibited from owning property. So you can, work, pay rent all your life instead of a mortgage and still not own the property. And again, this goes back to the Israeli narratives that, when they call Palestinians in the lands that were occupied in 1948, what's Israel now, and there's still 1.5 million Palestinians there, they call them Israeli Arabs, not Israeli Palestinians, because Israel wants to say there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. And their argument for the refugees is there's so many vast and wide Arab lands. Why don't they just forget about Palestine and live there happily? And you can start seeing that you're reminded that you don't belong in these countries. And here I'm talking on the state level, not the people level. I'm not talking about the Lebanese people who can be very supportive. I'm talking about state practices. So part of the reason why there's more exclusions, I just highlighted the two main ones. Part of the reason why there's this exclusion is because Lebanon has a sectarian or consociational system similar to the one in Northern Ireland. So the rights of the citizens are based on sectarian belonging. And different Lebanese sects have a kind of a cozy, they're in a relationship of friends and enemies between each other, but they all count within the sectarian system. They're all relevant. They have this kind of cozy antagonism. And this description is by a sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman. I didn't come up with this description, but I applied it to the Lebanese case. And against this cozy antagonism, there's the Palestinian stranger that disrupts the sectarian system by being by bringing the categories of the sectarian system into question, mainly by being similar to the Lebanese. Like it doesn't mean much whether you're a Lebanese Christian or Muslim when there's also the same culturally and religiously similar Palestinian refugee. So what is all this, story about the sectarian system? It's a bit complicated. I've published on this. At the bottom, you can see I have a journal article that explains this with evidence and in more detail if you're interested. Maybe it's too much to get into in this talk. So the article is Constitution of Lebanon and the Palestinian Threat of Sameness. Some say that Palestinians are excluded because they were involved in the Lebanese civil war. Some even say they started the Lebanese civil war, but many also say they were an external factor. There were Lebanese factors that led to the civil war. But the truth is that the discrimination or exclusion precedes the Lebanese civil war by 20 years. So since the early 1960s, Lebanese were excluded. The Lebanese civil war didn't start till 1975. Having said that, like I said before, Lebanon has paid the heaviest price for the Palestinian cause. So there's this contradictory feeling among Palestinian refugees that the state is so discriminatory, but then the people have sacrificed their lives, their homes, and everything for the Palestinian cause. A lot of the people, anyway. Some are against this, but a lot of Lebanese people. So it's just gets high like that. Moving to conditions where there's the biggest Palestinian refugee community, they're generally well integrated, and Palestinians are actually dominant in the economic sector. They own most big businesses and even small businesses. They're the backbone of the economy. Many have been naturalized as Jordanian citizens. On the other hand, Jordanians, the native Jordanians, dominate the state and the army. And this creates a bit of a tension. The Palestinians are dominant in the economy and the education sector, and the Jordanians are more dominant in the state and the army. And this creates a bit of a tension sometimes, but conditions are more or less much better than Lebanon. And also, there's this narrative that Jordan is the alternative homeland for Palestinians that adds to these tensions. So recently, there's been a bit of a revoking of Jordanian citizenships of some of the Palestinian Jordanians. Again, this goes back to the narrative that why don't Palestinian refugees just, they've been in these countries for decades, why don't they just forget about going back to Palestine? You're always reminded that you don't fully belong there one way or the other, even when you're well integrated in a country like Jordan. Conditions in Syria. Palestinians in Syria have been granted rights on an equal basis with Syrian citizens since 1949. So within a year of the refugee in Syria after the 1948 occupation and colonization, except for the political right to vote and citizenship. So they can even work in government. They get free education as the Syrian citizens. I'm talking before the conflict. Free healthcare, so on. They can work in any profession. And, for a while, they were almost envied as the most stable Palestinian refugee population until the breakout of the war in Syria in 2011. So even in Jordan in 1970, there was actually a military clash between the Palestinians and the Jordanian army. There was a long civil war in Lebanon. And, Palestinians in Syria had a really stable and well-integrated life up until the conflict in 2011. And of course, this has changed to some extent now. They're going through hard conditions. Again, I should mention that in all these places, in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, a segment of the Palestinians live in the refugee camps, like the pictures I showed in the beginning. And a segment of them, a bigger segment, lives in just like regular residential neighborhoods. But there are still many of them living in these refugee camps till today. Conditions in the West Bank, you can probably, I'll leave this to someone that's going to talk more about Palestine specifically, but you can see a lot of incursions by the Israeli military into the refugee camps, routine incursions, as well as wide-scale imprisonment. Actually, since 1967, when the West Bank was occupied, almost 750,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned in Israeli prisons for political reasons, like at different times. It might be a year, it might be longer. Some of them have been there for over 40 years, but at some point in their life, almost a million of the Palestinian male population since 1967 has been in Israeli prisons. In Gaza, as you may know now from the news more, that it's been under siege since 2007 up until present. And like I said in the beginning, 1.7, almost the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees originally from northern historic Palestine, and a lot of them live in refugee camps that are experiencing more deprivation than the regular residential neighborhoods. I'm going to end with another one of the narratives or slogans by the early Zionist leaders and when they were colonizing Palestine in the 30s and 40s and so on, is that the old will die and the young will forget. So the roots of the occupation are actually not 1947, 48, 49, or the Nakba. It goes way before that. Again, I won't get into much detail, but it goes mainly back to the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was an agreement mainly between the UK, Britain, and France to divide Greater Syria and Iraq and the region that was under Ottoman rule, and create spheres of influence for themselves, or what they called the mandate. And in this agreement, as became clear a year later with the Balfour Declaration, Palestine was, Lebanon was designated to get its independence, so same with Syria, Jordan, but Palestine was designated as an international territory. And the reason for that is because there was already plans to create what Balfour, the former British Prime Minister in 1917, in the Balfour Declaration called a Jewish homeland, a home for Jews in Palestine, a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And at the time, Jews were less than 15% of the population. And he didn't even refer to the Palestinians as Palestinians. He said the other existing populations should not be affected. He didn't even want to use the word Palestinians. So this is the root of the problem. So the conflict has been going on for over 100 years, but Palestinians are still struggling in Palestine for their freedom. And there's been 75 years of refuginess, and Palestinians are still holding on to the right of return to their homes in historic Palestine. And you can see here at the bottom, that's the what symbolizes return. It's the keys that Palestinians took with them from their homes in 1948 on the hope of returning to these homes very soon. But some of them still hold these keys till now. You might have seen the huge key in the marches in Dublin that goes at the front of the protest. It's hard to miss. I find it quite impressive. One of my Palestinian friends in Dublin was joking that that's the key for the entire Palestine, not just one of the homes. It's just so big. Yeah. So that's pretty much. I kept it light and brief. If you have questions, I can go in more depth. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Waleed. That was absolutely brilliant, and it was fantastic. And also the use of your own family history intertwined with your research was a very great way to anchor the whole thing and to carry us through it as a narrative. It was very moving as well to see things like your grandmother working with UNRWA, or the deeds to your family's home as well. Those just, they're very powerful and moving images. So I suppose we'll move on to the other thing I was going to say is thanks for sharing that journal article. I'm sure we can add that into the information below the video on YouTube. Anyway, what we might do is move on and open the floor up to questions. I see we already have a hand or two up. Sean.
It was fantastic, very enlightening. Good to get an insight to some of in the more detail of the situation in the surrounding countries. A couple of questions you mentioned earlier on about. I wonder if you could talk a wee bit more about never being back to Palestine. You mentioned that you hadn't returned, and I'm assuming this is because you can't. Or is there other reasons, or could you speak a wee bit more about that?
Okay, Alan, Sean, thanks for your question. So it's a bit of, I'm not really, up until the age of 36, I was on a Palestine refugee document from Lebanon. So there's this, it's not even a passport, it's a travel document for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. So up until the age of 36, that was out of the question. For the past few years, I've had the Irish citizenship. And, I could try going to Palestine for a visit. Like I would never be able to return. But maybe I can just go for like a week or two to see my country, just see what it actually feels or looks like to be there. But then I'm not guaranteed getting in. Usually they will ask, they would see my Arab name, they would ask where you're originally from, Palestinian problems. The trouble is already starting. Palestinian from Lebanon gets worse. Probably saying Irish citizenship even makes it, even now. And then they would interrogate you for 5 or 7 hours or so on. Sometimes it can go up to 12 hours. Like not full interrogation. Part of it is interrogation, part of it is they just leave you there. And then they might turn you back. And part of it is a personal barrier. I'm finding it difficult
Of course.
to get myself to go through Israeli, to even try this, to go through Israeli security, to get into my own country and have to explain to them why I'm going. It's a bit of a emotional barrier, and it's also a bit of a, they might not even let me in, even with the Irish citizenship.
Yeah, I totally feel you. I've been in Ben Gurion Airport, and I've seen how Palestinians are treated, and people who have Palestinian names are treated by the staff there. And it's horrifying. It's disgusting. It's so. I was just wondering how much. So I totally get the emotional barrier to not go back, to not be able to go back to a place where your heritage is from, where your identity is from, and to see it transformed and ripped apart by a separation barrier, and settlements and forests grown over the towns that were ethnically cleansed, and all of that there, the heartbreak of having to experience that would be considerable. And then, of course, there is the fact that it was out of the question to you before you were 46, just the ritualistic humiliation that you would potentially leave yourself open to. And then another question's a wee bit.
I just want to add one thing. If I can just add one thing, I'm actually privileged to consider whether I want to overcome my emotional barrier or not, because the 6 million refugees I mentioned, pretty much most of them, the vast majority, don't have other European citizenships or Western citizenships that would allow them to get, like, they don't even have that choice of saying,
yes,
will I try this now or should I postpone it or so on.
Yeah.
But, yep.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. You answered my question well. And then the other thing was about Jordan. I nipped into Jordan after I was in Palestine for a wee while, and I found what you were saying very interesting. But somebody was telling me, and I found it really hard to believe, that the population, like, Jordan's obviously not a democracy; it's a monarchy, but that the population of Jordan is something like 60 or 70% Palestinian.
That's true. Yeah, that is true. And when it comes to Amman, the capital, it's almost 90% Palestinian. It's you think of it, up to 70% of the population of Jordan is Palestinian, like you said, and they're quite. A lot of them are in quite powerful positions, and that kind of sometimes creates a bit of tension or anxiety. Things have improved much recently, but there were points where there was tension between, indigenous Jordanians and Palestinian Jordanians. Yep.
That's questions. Look, I could talk to you all night and bore the hell out of everybody else here, but I just want to pay tribute to you for your for your talk. It was fantastic, for your dignity, for your courage, and hopefully all together, working together, we can affect the change in the coming years.
I just froze for a second. Sean, thanks a lot for your great, kind words. Thank you for that. But go ahead, Colin. Yep. My internet connection seems to be not very stable today, maybe.
No problem. We have a question here in the chat from Roshin, who says Shukran, and just was wondering if you could talk a bit about the that kind of initial, I suppose, generation of emigration of Jewish people to Palestine from the early Zionist movement up until just before up before World War II.
Okay, so like I mentioned that in there was a very small indigenous Palestinian Jewish population before 1890. But most Palestinians were either Muslim or Christian. But then there was persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, and then the first wave arrived around 1880s, and they came mainly from Russia, and they were about 3.5% of the population, and they weren't really Zionists. They just were fleeing persecution. Maybe they felt they have some link to this land, and they weren't there to colonize the land. They just wanted somewhere to live. Later waves in the 1920s, 30s, with more militant kind of more Zionist. Jews coming from Poland and Germany mostly, as well as other parts of Eastern Europe, they had the idea of they want to slowly, make this their own homeland. There was the Balfour Declaration in 1917, like I said, and also in 1897, the Zionist movement took off. So the Jews that arrived before the 1890s, the Zionist movement wasn't really there, so they didn't have that idea strongly. So from the 20s and 30s, they wanted to create a homeland for Jews in Palestine, or what is Israel. The British mandate helped them do this. So there was a separate Jewish education system. They let them dominate some economic sectors. They made Hebrew an official language alongside Arabic and English. So a state was already being created before 1948 through the British mandate. Palestinians were disarmed while Zionists were being armed, and this was not a normal practice for the British and other British colonies. They wouldn't arm different nations or ethnicities or so on, but they were arming the Zionists. So by the time there was the partition resolution in 1947, where the UN said Jews will get half of Palestine, Arabs who owned most of the land said no, the war broke out. There was already a kind of a semi-Zionist or Israeli army, a Jewish army. Israel wasn't there yet till 1948. There was actually active steps. They were creating their own education system, the official language, the military, the parts of the economy were being dominated by Jews. They were trying to buy a lot of land. There was fund for buying land, but most Palestinians would not sell their lands. And as you saw, at least 93% of the land was still Palestinian owned when Israel was created. So this is kind of the history. There was a big wave also during the years of World War II and the Holocaust. Around an extra 200,000 Jews or Zionists, depending on where they stand, arrived in Palestine as well. And the British were really allowing this migration or settlement to happen. There was a revolt in 1936 to 39 where Palestinians tried to stop this Zionist arrivals into Palestine, but it was also suppressed by the British. So that's kind of, I don't know if you have more questions, Roshan.
That's a very thorough answer. Thank you, Waleed. We have another question now from Mohammed.
مساء الخير. Good night. مرحبا أخ وليد, كيف حالك? How are you doing? My name is Muhammad. I am from Hebron, south of West Bank, exactly from الظهرية. It's a village 15 kilometers north of Bir Saba and 20 kilometers southern of Hebron.
Okay, that's great to know.
I want to add something about how can you visit, about the question about the visit to Palestine, you as a refugee. I read once a book by Hisham Sharabi, a person who lived in the USA. He wrote about visit to Jaffa in 1993. He's the owner of the land and came there by a visa, a visit visa, while Russian people who are immigrants were citizens. I think the book's name is Bitterness and Anger. I think it's the name. He described everything, to educate ourselves I think we can read it again and see how the bitterness of Hisham Sharabi when he was describing his being in Jaffa, his homeland, his home village, and he is a visitor, while the immigrants from Russia, Ukraine, and other parts of the world are the citizens there. Thank you, Mr. Waleed, for being with us. I'm really got something new from you, though I am a good reader for history, but you have added something that is new for me. Thank you for Teachers for Palestine. They are doing great effort, and we feel they are Palestinians more than the Palestinians themselves. They are great, Mr. Waleed. They follow every detail, and they try to do their best with big effort to help Palestinians, especially the people in Gaza. Thank you all, men, and thank you, Mr. Waleed.
Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you for reminding me of Sharabi's book. And also I want to add, just like you did, I thank all the Irish teachers and teachers in Ireland for having an interest in this and trying to do something about it. Of course, we really appreciate this as Palestinians, just like you said, Muhammad, and we really value this, and it means a lot to us. So that's it. Yeah. If anyone else has any questions.
I don't know if the camera's picking up how much I'm blushing, but your praise is a bit over, or you know what I mean. It's a bit far. I don't know if we'd be more Palestinians.
It's deserved.
But it's greatly appreciated. Thank you, Andrew.
That's typical Palestinian overly effusive praise. They're all about the praise and massaging the egos. Do that all the time.
The thing about the Irish, will take it. Sorry, Andrew.
No, okay. That was worth it.
Suppose that you know some Arabic, so we spoke in Arabic just to remind you by some words. I know you are speaking Arabic, but about the Irish teachers, our colleagues, Andrew is a good translator for Arabic. He told me once.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
His Google worked very well.
My Google Translate works brilliantly. In WhatsApp groups anyway. Waleed, thank you so much for that. I think it's so important because it's an aspect that not a lot of people know about. And I speak as an Irish person who grown up wouldn't have heard much about it because it's not in their history books. There might be a paragraph on it in their history books in the foundation of the State of Israel, but nothing about they expelled everybody who was, well, not everybody, but a good 90 or whatever 80% of those people out at the time. And I often wonder why settlers are called settlers, the people who come in to live on the land that people have been expelled from. It seems more like plantations to me, like from our own history, where people are brought in from around the world and planted into these illegal settlements. So I often wonder about the word settlements. Maybe it should be called planters instead. I think it's really important that people get a notion of what you're talking. If you travel, like so many people in Ireland have travelled maybe to Tel Aviv on holiday, or they may have went to a football match in Tel Aviv, etc. And I've been to Palestine myself, and you obviously have to go through Tel Aviv, so we fly in through the airport. But when you're in Tel Aviv, you wouldn't have no clue any of this is going on. It's like a modern city. It's like walking down the street in Dublin. It's like walking down the street in New York. It's cafeterias everywhere, a lovely beach, people playing volleyball. You would have no clue this is going on. And it's only then when you go to cross the border into Palestine and the checkpoints that are there, that it's beyond those walls where you see, as you were speaking about, and this is just within Palestine itself, the refugee camps and talking about places like Ada and different places that are there, that are the refugee camps, made out of stone, made out of houses. They're there for decades and decades and decades. And literally, usually when we think of refugees, we think of people move to the other side of the world, away from the conflict, to different countries to get out of a war zone or whatever. But some of these people may have moved 10 kilometers away, and you can see their old homes literally over the wall from where they were expelled from. And it must be nauseating for them to see that every single day of the week. And my question is, it took me a long time to get to the question. My question is,
yeah.
what do you see in the right of return? So do you see amongst the younger generations, hopefully not, but would you, through your studies when you were looking at these, do you feel it wanes, the want to return, or do you feel that it's still as strong as it ever was early on? That's the first thing. And my second thing is, given that when you're in, let's say Tel Aviv, it's probably one of the most modern cities there. If you're there, you would have no clue what's going on. I wonder to what extent a lot of the Israelis themselves understand what's after happening and where they're actually living. It comes to mind, like when we think back to October 7th and the events and stuff that happened there, and we won't get into whether you agree, whether you disagree, any of that. I'm just talking, to what extent do people who were living in some of those kibbutzes, in some of those areas, understand that the people behind that wall over there were thrown off where I'm now living? And would you have any kind of, through your studies, of any sense of their own kind of self-thoughts about that?
So going to the first question, like if I want to speak in concrete terms, going to my study in Lebanon, Palestinians, even the young generation, are still strongly holding on to the right of return. They haven't forgotten about Palestine. They know which town, village, city they're from. There's been stories that have been passed down at this point from their great-grandmothers. They would even be fourth-generation refugees. I'm third generation. Their great-grandmothers and their grandmothers and so on. I have cousins in different parts of Europe. My family from my mom's side is quite big. I can see some of them actually don't speak Arabic. They're second generation at this point, but they still think of Palestine and try to be active. And they haven't forgotten about Palestine. And maybe to be realistic, maybe with some people who are second or third generation, maybe the urge is not as strong. But overall, there's still this feeling that we hold on to the right of return, and we would like to return to Palestine. If we get our freedom one day, I would say maybe a segment of Palestinians might not return, to be realistic, but the majority, especially the ones that are, the 5.9 million that I talked about that are registered by UNRWA, they would have a very strong urge to return to their homes and lands and their own country, because, as I said, things are not always so great for them abroad. And there's also this feeling of this is our home. It's not just about material conditions. It's our dignity is connected to it, our historical memory, our historical rights, and so on. Going to the second question, I haven't done research on Israeli society, maybe because I've never been there. But when I was before I got into academia, I was working in an NGO in Lebanon, and there was actually someone coming from Ireland, from Cork, and he was going to Palestine and Israel, and he had more interaction, and he said, on some level, they're a nation in denial when you talk about those ones in Tel Aviv or even the kibbutz. But I think it's becoming more difficult for them to stay in this denial, with all the international outrage that's happening at the moment. Everybody can see what's happening. It's no longer just the Palestinians that they can ignore, and what's happening in Ireland is very impactful as well, and in other parts of the world, that the world is telling them we can see what's happening, and this is not acceptable. And people are starting to ask questions and about the history and other aspects as well. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Waleed.
Can I add something about the first question of Andrew about the right of return?
Of course, Mohammed, go ahead.
Okay. If we do a statistic about the names, we might find 20% to 20 to 40% of Palestinian names are related to villages and areas in the 1948 lands. you will find 10,000s of Yafa, for example, and you will find thousands Carmel and thousands Safad. I myself, I am not a refugee, by the way, and I am from the same area where I live. My four sons, 2 sons and 2 daughters are named after villages in Palestine. My eldest son is El Carmel. It's a name of a hill in Haifa. My daughter is Majdal. Majdal is the place where most of Gazan people were. And the second daughter is Miron. Miron is an area between Lebanon and Palestine. And the other son is El Jalil. And Jalil is an area also in Palestine. We have too many names that were named after areas in Palestine. So the right of return will never outdated. It remains rings in our ears till people go back to their land. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree,
That's
Mohammed. I agree. It's still very strong.
It's very powerful as well to see that symbolism of the names embodying the places that that refugees have and one day will be able have the right to, and hopefully one day will be able to return to. Any more questions?
I just asked a question there, and it is kind of on refugees.
Yeah.
Just what do you think we can be doing as people who are inspired to act with regard to Egypt and the opening of the border, and what's the best way to focus our efforts in respect of that?
So I think the issue to highlight now, just like there's an outrage against the war, and people are being very vocal, it's also important because people tend to forget the refugee situation. Sometimes it gets pushed back to the background, to be vocal that it's also unacceptable that Palestinians in Gaza are displaced again and just pushed either to Egypt, or Israel was even saying to Rwanda, that if Rwanda or Congo would accept a segment of the Palestinians in Gaza, this shouldn't be acceptable at any level. They've already been displaced more than once. This is their country, and we should be vocal that this is not acceptable on any level.
But in the short term, in terms of the humanitarian, I understand in the long term we want the right of return and people to go back to their homes. But one thing I'm hearing is that Egyptians saying, "Oh, Palestinians don't want the border opened because they don't want to be displaced outside of their country." But I would imagine with the humanitarian crisis, would that be in the short term reduce the humanitarian crisis, or?
So what I was saying was also on the short term. So this is happening now. Israel is trying to expel the Palestinians of Gaza at the moment, and we need to be vocal about that. But also on the Egyptian border, most of the vicious fighting happened in northern Gaza, and there's still Palestinian civilians there. People, maybe some people can't take it anymore, and they would like to maybe escape the border towards Egypt. But there's also people that are holding ground and don't want to leave. And in terms of Egypt not wanting to open the border, the Egyptian government is not being brave enough. They have agreements with Israel, and Israel is telling them at the moment to not allow any aid in. When it comes to Palestinian fleeing, that's more or being expelled. That's a more complex issue that I don't really have the answer for at the moment.
Okay,
but thanks for your question.
Thanks.
I think that's an important point Waleed made there about the Egyptian border. I think the key thing here is, if you look at Waleed's whole presentation about and all his studies on the refugees, Palestinian refugees in the neighboring countries and indeed in Palestine itself, I think the key is that they were never left to return, and that's the massive fear for people. If history showed us that these terrible things happened, but the refugees were left to return to their land, etc., left to return to their homes once this bombardment and war and murder was over, but that's not the situation. And I think history tells us that they will never be left to return to those homes that they've been forced out of. if they do flee across the border. And I think that's why many of them are staying. It's not an ordinary situation. And in any other country, if there's a war, that people flee and they flee for a few months, maybe a few years, and they know they're going back home. So it's an easier decision for them to flee. But I think the decision for a lot of Palestinians is much, much harder because, they're leaving everything, literally everything behind, more than likely never to return again, I think.
That's definitely true, Andrew. Definitely, we've learned from experience that like we should try as much as we can not to leave, because if we leave, we're not coming back. And there are definitely Palestinians in Gaza now who would rather, even die there than go out again. And this is evident in North Gaza, where there's still, a couple of 100,000 left that won't even leave, because they're telling them to leave to the safe zones in the south of Gaza, and they won't even leave the north of Gaza because they just don't want to leave their homes again.
And Israel doesn't allow to the Palestinians who are from the north to return to the north, even they are still in Gaza. What about if leaving out of the borders? Will Israel allow them to go back? Never, ever. And Israel doesn't give the right for them to go back home. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much, Waleed. That was a brilliant presentation and discussion. Thanks everyone as well who contributed to the discussion, and those who came along to listen, and indeed those of you who are watching this on YouTube. Thank you very much, and please do check out Waleed's journal article, which we'll include below, and also please follow us on Teachers for Palestine on Instagram, Teachers for Pal, or at Teachers for Pal on Twitter, and join us on the marches as well. Thank you very much, and I suppose we'll call it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.